excited to kind of go through this series. We've been going through this series on God and the Family while they have been doing renovations on the preschool next door. And it's been really fun. It's been really fun for us as a family just to kind of talk to our kids about some of these things that we're talking through. And even though like ones are talking about like today, about the gifts of singleness in marriage, my kids, your kids are not at that place and shouldn't be, yet. But they need to start thinking about these types of things, and having conversations with your kids and having conversations as families is a good place to be. We need to have a healthy place to talk about those things and a healthy way to talk about those things so that when they do come one day, your kids are going to look to you and have conversations with you, and it's not going to be this weird, awkward situation that maybe you grew up with or you don't want the same to happen to your kids. So it's been fun to watch our kids and it just kind of have this kind of relationship with them. And so we have also, if you turn in your bags, kids, if you turn in your bags in the back, there's a little white piece of paper, the car ride chat. And so we're encouraging you guys to go back home, and on the way back home, have a conversation with your family. Talk about this as a family. Ask those questions. Ask the difficult questions. Just have a conversation and see what your kids hear and what they respond to. This is a remote control, and it is often lost at my house. In fact, most remote controls, they find a way of getting lost, and they wind up in weird places sometimes. I don't know if the same thing happens to you, like in the bathroom or, behind a couch. It happens when you have kids and they think we're in a trash can, wherever it may be. But I want to talk a little about, this is actually a DVD remote. And back in the day, when you had VCRs, how many of you guys remember VCRs? Yeah, there's a couple. Okay, that's good. You got this feature on there, the rewind and fast forward. And what you do is you'd hit the fast forward to go past. You can still do that today with DVDs and that kind of thing, but you usually skip past certain scenes. And then you can rewind and go back if you want to see something else. In our house, Lindsay a lot of times likes to rewind if she misses something, doesn't quite hear something, and it drives me crazy. I want to watch the whole thing through without hitting rewind at all. But she likes to do that, so you got to rewind and fast forward. And I was thinking about this when it came to this topic today, the gifts of singleness in marriage. I think oftentimes in life, we typically like to either rewind back to a time when life was particularly good, or we thought we had it really good. Life now is not good. We want to go back to that time when it was good. Or we do the opposite. We're always trying to fast forward to go to that place in life where life finally gets good. And I'm particularly talking today about relationships in the sense of singleness and in marriage. Some of us, maybe if you're single, you're looking forward to that day when you can get married. And you're constantly hitting that fast forward button thinking, I just want to get to this point where I can get married. Some of you guys, maybe you want kids and you're married and you're like, I just want that day when we can have kids. Or whatever it may be. Grandkids, or when my kids get out of the house, or when they get jobs, or whatever it may be. Some of you guys may be going back thinking of, man, I remember those days when life was easy. I was single and I could do whatever I wanted to do, and maybe you're married and you're looking back in those days and of fondness. And I'm going to encourage us today to think through, and I think it's what Paul talks in 1 Corinthians 7 will be today, is that God wants us to look at the situation of life we are in, to look at how we can best steward the situation of life that we are in for His glory. How can you use the position God has placed you in, whether you're single or you're married, whatever job you have, however many kids you have or don't have, whatever position that you are in life, how can you best use that for God's glory? And I want us to think through that, because oftentimes we go back to the fast forward or rewind buttons. And we think, well, if only I could get this, or if only I could go back, life would be good again. But those attitudes are sinful. And we all do it. There's not one person in the room who doesn't think through, if this could get past, or I can get past this stage, or go back to that stage, life would get better. It doesn't. And the grass is always greener. We always look for those things in life where we can move ahead or move back. But particularly when it comes to these two things, of singleness and in marriage, I want us to think through that today. I remember when I was single, and man, I loved playing video games. I mean, I still today, if I had the time, I'd play video games like 24/7. And I'm just being honest here, right? This is a safe place to admit this. But as we got married, I realized, like, if I was playing a game all night and I didn't get a chance to see Lindsay, like, it wasn't very healthy for my marriage. Like, we're not talking, we're not interacting, we're not having, like, that close time together because I'm playing a video game and I'm trying to get to the next level, right? Not healthy for my marriage, but when I'm single, I remember, man, I played so many video games, it was crazy, right? I had a system and I would play and play and play and play, and it was fun. I loved it. And even today, there's another thing I love to do is eating cheese sticks. I love cheese sticks. That's my weakness. Along with Starburst jelly beans, you got cheese sticks on the other side, and life is good. I mean, I could just go through a ton of cheese sticks, a whole pack, just in one sitting, easy. Now with kids, I'm not allowed to, I have a quota on my cheese sticks that I can eat, because my kids, the cheese sticks are for them, mostly. So I can get like 2, and then I'm done. And I have to wait till my wife gets another bag of cheese sticks, and then I can go through and eat some more. Well, sometimes I may sneak 1 or 2, but anyways, it's not always a good thing, not healthy for the marriage. And I think of, like, there are things, benefits on each stage of life, whether you're single, and I mean not just those types of things, but I mean things that can honor God in the way whether you're single or whether you're married. I remember in my single life, I had so much time, all the time in the world. And I could, freedom of schedule, I wasn't timing everything around when's nap time or when's lunch time or when's snack or when's changing a diaper. Everything was basically up to my own discretion of when I wanted to spend my time. When I got married, I have a partner now in life, a companion, someone to spend life with that's not lonely, somebody that I can talk to just about anything. But with that, our time is limited as far as our individual time goes. Benefits to both. And I think as Paul talks in today, I want us to see how we can use the situation we're in best for God's glory. Let's look in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and we're going to be in verse 6. It says, "Now as a concession, not a command, I say this, I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. To the married, I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife." So, 2 things here he's talking about, kind of hits both camps, singleness and marriage. First, we're going to talk about singleness, and most of the sermon today, we're going to be talking about singleness. And again, I realize we have a lot of married people in the room, but there's also a lot of single people. There's also a lot that are kids, and so you're not there yet. But this is something just to think through as you go through life and things of what the Bible says and how to deal with these types of things. So we're going to spend most of our time with singleness, and as Paul does mostly in 1 Corinthians 7, and talking specifically about that. But he says here, first of all, now as a concession, not a command. And this is an interesting way that Paul is starting off his line of thinking by saying, a concession, not a command. This isn't something you have to do. You don't have to be single. Obviously, he gets to a point about marriage, and he talks a lot in his writings about marriage. In the church world, we have groups that do one of two different things, and they err on either side. One is we act as though marriage is the Holy Grail. Once you get married, life is complete, and you're there. You've arrived. And so in this situation, some people even, there's some groups who would go as far to say that your salvation is dependent upon your marriage, which isn't biblical at all, because Paul here was clearly not married. So if marriage is dependent, salvation is dependent upon marriage, then the Apostle Paul wouldn't have been saved, which is foolishness. So it's not dependent upon your salvation. And Paul uses both sides to say both are good. So you have one group who says marriage is the pinnacle, and singleness is just something you do as a transitional state until you get married. That's unhealthy and unbiblical. On the other side of it, you have those who act as though singleness, and there's some groups who would say that singleness is the Holy Grail. And there's not probably as many groups today that feel that way, but I'd say probably another part of that is our culture. Our culture sometimes would say, hey, singleness is good. If you get married, you have a ball and chain. You got someone that's always getting on you about everything. Wouldn't it be better to be single and you have your own time, and have your own place, and have your own stuff? And you don't have to worry about sharing that with anybody. Both sides are wrong, but Paul's going to give his reason for why he's chosen to be single and why this is something he believes that God has pointed him down this path and how he can best use this for his glory, God's glory. Secondly, he says, I wish that all were as I myself am. Paul's realizing this is something, a lifestyle that he's chosen that has been very good for him in his ministry as he goes around preaching from church to church. Think about just what Paul does on a day-to-day basis. He walks into a new town and he goes to the synagogue, and what does he do? He starts preaching and sharing the gospel everywhere he goes. Sometimes he gets stoned, sometimes he gets beaten, gets back up, goes to the next town, and starts preaching the gospel again. Now just think about that from the standpoint of your family. Imagine carrying your family around from city to city to city to city, preaching the gospel, getting beaten everywhere you go. It's kind of hard to maintain a good routine and family order and do nap times and diapers and everything else that you've got going on while you're going around preaching the gospel and getting beaten like that. But this is what Paul chose, realizing this is how he could best be used for God's glory in this stage of life and staying single. So he wishes that all were as I myself am. Paul, again, also is a preacher. He's sharing the gospel. He's going around from place to place, and he wants others to do the same. He encourages others to share the gospel. But each has his own gift from God. Each has his own gift from God. So here's where Paul deviates from his kind of like line of thinking, showing the reasons why he's chosen to be single, and saying each is its own gift from God. Now, gifts. When Paul is saying each is its own gift, these are good gifts. They're not like bad gifts, like one of our first Christmases, and I gave Lindsay what I thought was the best thing ever. It was like practical, and it made a lot of sense for the family. And this was something that was going to help her and be just this amazing thing. I got her a key finder that you whistle, and you find your keys. That's a good gift, right? It's smart, it's logical. Every guy in the room is probably thinking, yeah, that makes sense. You did good. And every woman's like, what are you, an idiot? That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard of. Well, it was the dumbest thing. So it was a really bad gift. And it made it even worse was that the whistle didn't work because you had to get just the right pitch for the whistle to go off on, and we couldn't hit that pitch, whatever it was. But occasionally when we had lost the key finder and the TV goes off at hitting that certain pitch, the key finder would go off at that certain pitch. So it was like a terrible, terrible present. He's not talking about a present like that. He's talking about good gifts. Good gifts. That singleness and marriage are both to be seen as good gifts from the Lord. However, we typically act as though one is better than another. Now, depending on where you're at, I don't know where you're at, but maybe you feel that way. I think sometimes in church world, here's what we do to single people. We go, one day you'll get married. One day you'll find somebody. One day you'll do this. And we make these false promises and we say all these things, and it's wrong. We shouldn't be trying to force something that maybe God doesn't want to begin with. Now, again, I'm not here to say if you're single, that's where your destination is going to end, or if, you made a wrong decision getting married or you didn't. I'm not here to say those types of things. I'm just here to say for us to just look at the situation in which we're in and to learn how to see that this is something God can use for his glory and how we can use that to be served in his kingdom. So that both are good gifts. Both marriage and singleness serve a purpose. Both can glorify God. I think for single people, I just want to kind of camp out here for a second and see your singleness as a gift from God. I think a lot of times, and I think just back to my own self here, I'm not saying this about anybody else, but when I was single, I had one thought on my mind, and that was, how in the world can I get married? Who's that girl? Where can I find this girl? Where's she going to be? Who in the world is she going to be? And I was looking around, and you get in long-term relationships and dating relationships, and you settle for situations that you shouldn't. And I found myself constantly trying to make something happen because I wanted to be married. I wanted that person to be alongside of me. I knew I was going to be called, it's called a ministry. I was looking for that companion that I could share life with. And I think a lot of the mistakes that I made were because I was trying to make that happen and force that to happen. And that was my end goal. My end goal was not to glorify God. My end goal was to get married. And I was wasting my time thinking about this and making this my obsession when God was not my obsession, but this end was my obsession of getting married. And I think if we're not careful, we can let that obsession become our end. And everything in our life is focused around making that our end. How many times do we have issues or things? I mean, I remember when I was in college, I would go to a church based on the girls that were there. Now you're like, okay, this church has more girls there. Okay, I'm going to go check out that college ministry. Oh yeah, now this one, oh, they don't have as many, so I'm not going to go over there this Sunday. Or I knew this girl was going to be at this church this Sunday. Okay, this is where I'm going, right? And we make decisions based on what we're trying to have happen. And that's not right. It doesn't glorify God. It's exalting this other end of it in and of itself. Make sure that we are focusing on the worship of God. Why do we do this? Why do we come to church? Why do we worship God? It's because He deserves all the glory. He deserves everything, and we should try to see our lives as a gift from God and how we can best use that for Him, not what can we get from Him. So what does our prayers typically look like if that's the obsession? Our prayers are, God, can you give me a spouse? Please, grant me, give me a spouse. I don't care who, just bring her in my lap, or maybe it's your girl, bring him in my lap, whoever it is. Just, I want this person here. And that's your prayer, and that's the end of everything that you're praying. It's not, how does this glorify God? Good gifts. Paul even, later on in the chapter here, we're going to read through this in verse 32 to 35, he gives his reasons why he prefers singleness. Let's look down at verse 32 of chapter 7. It says, I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the world, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife. And his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. I mean, again, Paul says here in verse 35, he doesn't want to lay any restraint upon anybody. He's not trying to pick their course of life and their direction. That he should say, you should just be single. He's not trying to force that to happen, but he wants to give his reasons. The first thing he says here is, I want you to be free from anxieties. And this is true. The more people you are taking care of in this world, the more anxious you may become. Because if you have problems, what happens when you are taking care of other people who also have problems? Their problems become your problems. Their worries become your worries. You are taking care of multiple people. The more kids that we have, the more that I'm concerned financially about taking care of them physically, that they have food on the table to eat, that we can take them to the doctor and take care of any ailments that they have. We want to clothe them. We want to make sure that we are doing all these things so that we can take care of our kids. That is a good thing. That's a righteous thing. We should be doing that as parents. That is our role. We should be teaching and instructing our kids to follow Jesus. But we have more people to be concerned about. Paul's saying, I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife. We've been talking the last 2 sermons on Sundays. As husbands, as wives, we have responsibilities and obligations to our spouses first. Not before the Lord, obligations to the Lord, but we have obligations then to our husbands and wives, because that is holy and biblical and righteous. Men, that you would love your wives more than you would love yourself. Ladies, that you would see your husband and all his flaws and all his failings and all that he's got, and you would respect him and submit to his leadership of your home. Both of those things, like fly in the face of everything we have in our culture, that we would do those two things. But in doing so, we are glorifying God. Now, in that, as you worry about your spouse and you're taking care of your spouse, that is becoming something that's very big. If your spouse is going through something major, your job and responsibility is to be there with them through that. You don't write it off and go, I don't really care what you have going on, honey. I've got things to do. I just think about just being honest with you in church planning. Our first year into church planning, man, it was busy. I mean, there's always something to do. There's always things going on. There's 1,000 things that I could be doing and spending my time doing. And I realized that I was spending every waking moment thinking about this church plant, trying to make sure that things didn't fall apart at the seams and things weren't blowing up here and this fire was going out and this fire had to be put out and that everything was going to be good. And I was focusing in on this church. And as we started going down the road, I realized there were a couple of conversations with my wife that she was not my pursuit. I was pursuing other things, even godly things, more than the well-being and maintenance of my wife and care of my wife. I was making sure that she was okay. She was loved. She was being pursued, not other things. And being married, when you make those vows on your wedding day, you are not just saying words. You're making a commitment to your spouse for the rest of your life that this person you are going to love and honor and cherish for the rest of your life, just as Jesus loved us. No matter what wrong they've done, no matter how they've messed up, that's how you're to love them. Now that's a commitment. That's a lot. When you make those vows, there's so many good things about marriage, so many great things about marriage, so many awesome things that I would never trade for the world. But it's hard. It's difficult. And Paul wants us to understand that if you are single and you choose to remain single, that you can be free from those kind of commitments in order so that you can love God and follow God in a different way. And he wants us to understand that soberly. What do we do on the wedding day? All right, it's all beautiful. Man, I've done a lot of weddings, and almost every wedding, right? They kind of see the pastor's job, okay, yeah, you're just kind of here. As long as you're looking good for the pictures, we're good. But, all that spiritual stuff, I mean, like that's good and everything. We know you need to do that. But really, we want the flowers, and it's all the decorations, and people spend all kinds of money for these beautiful weddings. And they're living for that day, the fairy tale ending, the happily ever after. And yet, marriage is a lifetime. Should be a lifetime of commitment, of following after one another, loving each other as you follow Jesus together. It's hard. It's difficult. Those commitments that you're making to one another, it's not just about this fairy tale ending. And because we've painted that as a culture, that marriage has this fairy tale ending, and you could have all your dreams and wishes and desires all fulfilled in this spouse, what we do is we just get married because we think that's the end in which we're after, and in doing so, we make all kinds of mistakes along the way. If you are single, this is a time to evaluate those things, those thoughts, those ideas, those desires in your mind now. As Paul said, there's benefits to both. Both are gifts from God. And we're going to see in a little bit here about marriage and the benefits of marriage. But if you're single, maybe the road you should be taking is singleness. Singleness. It kind of almost seems weird to say that. Like our culture is just so geared around this idea that you have to get married as the destination. But maybe that's what God has in mind, is singleness and how you can glorify God in your singleness. When you're married, your job is first and foremost to love your wife or your husband more than yourself. Your spouse comes before your hobbies, your interests, your ministries. Paul wanted to minister to people, and so he saw singleness as something that gave him more time. It allowed him just to focus on himself and to worry about himself. I mean, Paul was easy. He got stoned one day. He'd get up, walk to the next town, and preach again. I mean, he didn't care. I mean, just a flesh wound. I'll just walk it off, rub some dust on it, and just move on. And he goes off and keeps preaching again, right? Didn't have to care about that. Didn't care about his going to the emergency room or anything like that. I mean, he's like, I'm just going to walk on. My wife takes care of me, make sure I live longer. She makes sure I eat well, that I don't let things that are health issues that I continue to worry about. Like, it's good. I'm living longer in that. Paul saw this as for him as something that gave ministry focus. And then he says here, going back to verse 9, he says, but if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Now, Paul here is talking specifically about physical intimacy. And in our culture, we have a lie that says you should be physically intimate with somebody else before you're married. It's something that should happen because that allows you to kind of figure out if you're compatible in physical ways. And there's nothing biblical about that. That physical intimacy is reserved for marriage. That's how God designed it. And one of the things in there, it's a protection against sexual temptation, that we wouldn't be physically intimate outside of marriage because this is something that glorifies God. In this, if you can't control yourself, control your physical passions, he says it's okay to get married for those reasons. Now, in that, I think you got to be careful not to just use that as an excuse or a cop-out. But I think it's okay. And sometimes, some engagements, it's just like, why don't we just get married? Don't have to deal with that physical temptation. You both know that each other's the one for each other. Just get married. Just get married. It's something that's reserved for marriage. I think in marriage, and I'm not saying that we would just settle for the wrong person. I think that's one problem, is settling, but I think the opposite is waiting too long to get married. Sometimes for us, and Tim Keller, his book, this Momentary Marriage, it's a great book, and he talks about singleness in it. And one of the things he says in there about singleness is that we often have these unrealistic expectations about a spouse. If you're a girl, maybe you have this list. I'm not asking you to show us the list or anything like that, but you know if you have one. And it's like, I want a guy who has this color hair, and he is this tall, this range, this is what he does, this is what he likes to do, I want this. And then alongside of that, we're looking for people who we're mostly just physically attractive to, and as long as there were those physical attractions there, we're good. And I'm not saying you don't have to be attracted to your spouse. I think that's absolutely an important part of marriage. But it's not just physical attraction. It's not just fitting the boxes that we're trying to throw on this arbitrary thing. We're to see marriage as an end for us to glorify God. So if you are married in the room, you're supposed to see your marriage as something you can glorify God in. And if you're thinking of finding somebody, it's not just about finding all these certain physical things. We're looking for how we can glorify God in that. I think the opposite is settling, right? That we just have this obsession to get married so much that we just marry the wrong person. That's also the wrong goal and wrong end. Either way we look at it, the end is just our own obsession, not glorifying God. How can you tell? How can you tell if glorifying God is your main obsession or is it something else? Well, here's what you do. Ask yourself. Ask yourself, what do you think about? What do you worry about the most? What do you spend most of your money on? Those things will start to paint the picture of what's your obsession. And if your obsession is not following Jesus, then it's something else entirely, and those things need to be put back in their right focus. I remember when I met Lindsay, and this is, by the way, not a promise that this will also happen to you, but this was something that was good for me to remember. Again, wanting to be married, and just starting to realize that I had to put aside that obsession in order to put Jesus first. And as I did that, I met this girl, and one day, meeting her, having a conversation with her, I realizing this girl is spending her time with other people so that she can share God with them. Talk about Jesus to random people. Like that was what she loved to do. I remember that Lindsay didn't like me at first. And that was, of course, that's like a shot to a guy's pride, but it was good because I needed to know that I wasn't her obsession, but that God was her obsession. And in that, I found her very attractive. And I remember praying to God after I just met Lindsay, and I said, God, this girl's got everything I want, everything I've ever dreamed of. He says, if it's not her, I pray that it's somebody like her. And God gave me her. And it's the coolest thing just to know that, and again, for me, when I put that other stuff aside, God brings me the woman of my life. Now, not to say that's going to happen to you. The Bible's not making that promise. I'm not making that promise. God never promises that. Again, singleness might be the road for you the rest of your life. But when you're okay with whatever God's got for you, God tends to work through that. When you can just be okay with letting go of all those extra dreams and false hopes and false ends that we make and those fairy tale ends. And I'd say the same thing will work for your marriage. God tends to work through that. The second thing Paul says here is the gift of marriage. To the married, in verse 10, I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. Now again, he's talking just a glimpse of marriage. We've hit a lot of that in the last 2 weeks. If you haven't been here for the last 2 weeks, I'd encourage you to go back and to listen to the sermon from Ephesians 5 and Nick's, and then also the last one, honor, love, and respect, and really honing in on what it means to be married. But in that, our job as married, those who are married, is we're supposed to love each other for the rest of our lives. Now, I realize, like, in a room like this, divorce may be a part of your life, maybe a part of your past, maybe you've, made wrong decisions or mistakes in the past. God is gracious, God is forgiving, God is merciful. Just focus on the present. Where are you at right now? Are you married now? That spouse you're with now is the one you're supposed to have this kind of relationship with, that you love with that kind of commitment, you love with that covenant, that you spend the rest of your life with, not to be divorced, but to say, I'm going to love this person through thick and thin. When life is hard, when it's difficult, I'm going to love them. When they don't show love back to me, I'm going to love them anyways, because in this, it glorifies God. We see also, 2 weeks ago, we talked about marriage being a picture of the gospel. That in that, we see him as a man loves his wife, as Jesus loved the church, who gave himself up for her, who sacrificed himself self-sacrificially. He is showing the world Jesus. And in that, as we love our spouses that way, we are showing the world Jesus. That covenant of marriage is not to be taken lightly, is to be taken very seriously. And look down at verse 17. And I think this is kind of one of the key verses of this chapter. He says, only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. So if you are single or if you are married, what is Paul saying here about what God is saying about your situation? Let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him. That the Lord has assigned to him. Again, this is not to say if you're single, you're going to stay that way. I'm not going to make those kind of promises, but God is calling us to these situations in our lives. That if you have kids, or if you don't have kids, if you're married or if you're single, whatever it may be, God has placed you in that position. That is not by accident that you are there. How can you best glorify God in that situation of life in which you are in? If you're dating, how can you best glorify God in your dating relationship? How can you see God as the end in the way that you glorify him? Because he deserves all the credit. It's all his. He's the one who's given you life. He's the one that's given you everything that you have. How can you glorify God in the midst of that? God has called us to these things. God has called us to these places. And in that, he's given us good gifts. Final thoughts here, just a couple of things that I just want us to think through. I think as we think through the gifts of singleness and marriage, how can we best glorify God in that? One is embrace the relationship in which God has placed you in, whether it's marriage or whether it's singleness. Embrace it. Don't try to change it. Don't try to force things. Don't try to make things happen. Embrace the status in which you're in. Accept it. See it as a gift, not a curse. If you're single, enjoy your singleness and steward that relationship with God through that. Use your time. I mean, I just think about this. If you're single and you have time, you can use your hobbies as an interest in order to glorify God in the midst of that. You have a lot of time. Go spend your time with people who don't know the Lord. Get to know them. Get to share the gospel with them. You have time that's available to be able to do these types of things. If you're married, see your relationship with your wife or with your husband and honor God in the midst of that. Love that person sacrificially so that you can learn what it means to be sanctified. If you're married, hang around other married couples. I mean, be a mentor to those who are getting married or newly married couples. I mean, there's so many different ways you can use those things to honor and glorify God. Steward your relationship status for God's glory. Facebook's got that relationship status thing. And we were like I was a sophomore in college, Facebook came out with that, and it was always like single, married, or it's complicated, or dating. It was all these kind of funny things like that. And people would mess around like, oh, it's complicated, or if they started a dating relationship, like everybody would ask all these questions, and it would immediately become like this whole big ordeal. And your relationship status became the end in and of itself. How can we steward our relationship status, whether we're married or whether we're single, for God's glory? I mean, how can we see that as something we can honor God in, not something that's a curse to us, or not something that society sees as something that could be a pain to us? The end of our lives and the very obsession in which we hold ourselves to should be to bring honor and glory to the Lord. Here's what that means. If God is getting all the credit for what we're doing it right. If we are getting the credit or we're satisfying our own ends, we're doing it wrong. Whether you live sacrificially in a marriage or whether in your dating relationships or single relationships, how can you best glorify God in the midst of that? The question is, who gets the glory? Who gets satisfied? Who gets fulfilled? Is it God or is it you? Is it yourselves, your own belly, or is it the Lord? That's how we know if we're truly glorifying God. And in that, in our relationship status, we can show a lost world around us what it means to put God first and everything else come in between the midst of what it means to honor and glorify God. Let's pray.